welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're joined by Japan scholar and Asian security expert who is the first scholar to explain why Asia is a fractured region hamstrung by stagnation and instability instead of being the cohesive powerhouse so long predicted. It is known that China's economy continues to slump. Political unrest affects democracies and autocracies alike. Demographic crisis threaten productivity and prosperity, and the possibility of conflict in the South China Sea grows more threatening. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest and author of the book, The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risk to the World's Most Dynamic Region. Our guest, Michael R. Oslin. Michael, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Now, tell us about how you became interested in Asia and what this, how this really affects us.
Well, Asia is half our world, and we don't often think about that in the United States. But if you draw a circle around India, China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, more people live in that circle on our planet than live outside of it. Today, in fact, 1 out of every 3 people on Earth is of Indian or Chinese descent. It accounts for about 40% of global output. It obviously has the world's largest countries, but some of the world's largest democracies and nuclear powers and the biggest militaries. So even if you don't really think about Asia or you don't care about Asia that much, it is a part of your world that is really shaping everything from trade and economics to politics and security.
I remember back in when China had hosted Beijing and hosted the Olympics, and they constantly were hitting away at, here's this growing powerhouse, this political powerhouse, and just on and on and on, and, being a world power. And I thought to myself, I'm not so sure about that. Your book, The End of the Asian Century, is an interesting title, especially as you read the one chapter, The Miracle of China. And I was looking at that going, these people seem to be conducting business, if you will, in much of the way that early America used to. And I'm thinking to myself, geez, if they keep going on this course here and they're allowing this, which obviously they are, the long-term effects of it is going to be devastating for them. Tell us about that.
Well, I think first we have to recognize what has been the extraordinary success story of Asia over the past half-century. It started with Japan after World War II. It spread to what we call the Four Tigers, countries like South Korea and Taiwan. And then, of course, for the past 20 years or so, it's really been the story of China. It has transformed what was a region filled with third world nations into the leading powerhouse of the world. But while that's been happening, there have been extraordinary problems that have basically been ignored or brushed under the carpet. There has been a focus on the quick gain of a buck, so to speak, in many of these nations without thinking about how do they actually ensure that they maintain their growth and that they build for the next generation, not just for having what has been historically a relatively quick and short spurt. So if you look at China, you have to think about their debt problem. If you look at countries like Japan, you have to think about the aging of the population and the fact that they demographically have been declining already. If you look at relations between these countries in the South China Sea, they are getting closer to war. All of these are indicators that we actually thought would be going in the other direction, that these countries, as they got wealthier, as they became more integrated with the world and traded with each other, they'd solve their problems internally and externally. And unfortunately, what we see is just the opposite, that these problems are being ignored until maybe one day it'll be too late.
Yeah, I noticed that you were also talking about, for instance, in the book, that the idea that the farmer is being kind of pushed aside where there's more urban development, but it's putting things into a situation where, basically you have ghost cities. What's going on with that?
Well, the ghost cities in China are a particular phenomenon of the unbalanced growth, the fact that they still have centralized planning, and when the orders came down to build cities for all of the people that they assumed would be moving from the rural areas into the urban, they didn't take into account where the people were actually going. And where they were going was areas where there were already jobs. They were going to the big established cities. So they built these enormous cities, for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands or more people where no one lives because there's actually no industry around there. There's no work to be had. It's actually part of the reason why China has such an enormous debt problem is that the what we call what economists call malinvestment, the mismatched investment of what a state-centered or a top-down planning system demands versus what an actual market system would react to and more efficiently allocate. In China, you have a huge debt problem because of projects like this, which are simply a drain on economy and society.
Now, it's interesting how they apparently like working or how they work with other countries, especially the U.S., and you come to understand, for instance, that Asia, especially China, are really big about really piggybacking on the work of others. I remember a friend of mine back in the 1980s would say, don't bother trying to invent something and patent it because China's going to end up stealing it from you anyway. And I was pretty astounded to read, for instance, on just intellectual property alone, how much China took from the U.S. I think it was to the tune of some $300 billion, and just the kinds of things that they do there. And you think to yourself, why would anybody reasonably would want to be involved with someone like that, knowing that in the long term it just isn't going to work too well?
Well, it's a good question. It certainly gets to the short-term mentality that much of American economic trade policy is based on, which was exactly, as you pointed out, the idea that you could make a very quick buck because of the massive growth that was occurring in China. But there is story after story about American business being forced out of the China market or being forced out of a joint venture by their Chinese partner who steals the intellectual property or, of course, knockoffs of everything from computer software to handbags that steals intellectual property of Americans. Even worse, there was a Pentagon report a few years ago that indicated that essentially every major U.S. weapons program under development had been compromised by the Chinese, had been hacked, and that they were taking out data that allowed them to essentially copy our weapons, which means that, in essence, the U.S. taxpayer was subsidizing the growth of the Chinese economy. These were a lot of things we were willing to overlook when China was growing at 10% more a year because there were gains to be had. It was not a question of the fairness of it, but rather that there was money to be made, and if you didn't make it, someone else would. Now I think that dynamic is changing. The mindset is changing. American companies are finding it much harder to do business in China for some of the reasons that you indicated, as well as other reasons. There is obviously the knowledge now of the degree of cyber theft, and there is everything from again, the advanced use of computer hacking down to old-fashioned intimidation. So I think going forward, American businesses are going to be much more wary about doing business in China. It's going to be harder to do business in China, and part of that, of course, is because the overall economic picture in China itself is slowing down. The macro picture has gone way down from 10% growth or 9% growth or the like, down to what they say is roughly 6.5% growth, but most economists don't even believe that number. So really the bottom line is the bloom is off the rose on China, and we're going to have a very different attitude towards it in the coming years.
Now, we can see that our new president, Donald Trump, has kind of changed the game a little bit, wanting to dissolve the 12-nation Asian-Pacific Trade Pact while trying to seek a two-way trade deal with Japan. So how do you see Trump playing into all of this? What kinds of changes, if any, do you think are going to happen that may be positive or negative? Just what changes will there be?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we know yet, and I'm not sure that the administration itself knows. They are moving forward obviously on the trade front, doing what they said they would do, which is withdraw from TPP, but they have indicated, and the president has stated, that he would be willing to consider bilateral trade agreements. And he's already talked about one with the UK, and there is very early talk about one with Japan, and that would be very significant. You would link the world's first and third largest economies together. So if that's what he's willing to do, then we should push him on it, and we should push forward on that. That's an important thing. It is not as good as, I would argue, it's not as good as having TPP. It's not as good as when you can link together with a common set of standards 12 different nations. That would be a much better opportunity to create a liberal community of trading interests. But if this is what we're going to get, then we have to go with it. Other things that the president has talked about or mused about, for example, declaring China a currency manipulator or slapping tariffs on it, those are things we're going to have to wait and see whether they do. But in the first couple of weeks, it's really been more business as usual rather than something radically changing.
I remember, too, there was a time when it seemed there was a little bit of uncertainty when you would see, for instance, in India, which is part of this whole thing as well as China and, of course, Japan, the way their growing middle-class population seemed to exceed that of the United States, and we're worried that, that we were in a lot of trouble. But it seems to me the way that it has grown, that seems to be unstable as well. It isn't like, for instance, in China's case, they're really building anything, as we were discussing earlier. It's more like they piggyback and they take ideas and then they capitalize on those things and move forward. And you think to yourself, what do we have to worry about when it seems that, their economy has fallen into a slump, especially in China?
Well, this is a real challenge to our entire view of the sort of modern integrated trading world that we had. If there was one story about Asia, it's that its rise would be inexorable. Its economic rise would be inexorable. And if it wasn't Japan, after Japan petered out, it would be China. And as soon as China started slowing down a little bit, people were talking about India. So it's sort of a mindset that we have, that we have convinced ourselves that Asia is the goose that's going to lay the golden egg eternally. We should have learned lessons immediately from the Japanese case of 20 years ago or so. That clearly would have been a way that we could have understood failures of what was still state planning, even in a democratic country, failures of businesses to adapt, the limitations that a growing middle class actually provide. It's not a magic bullet, though we think it often is. But we didn't apply those lessons to other nations, and now we're about to face the same thing with China. So this book is not predictive. It's not predicting an economic meltdown. It's not predicting war or revolution or anything like that. But it does ask the questions of what we should be expecting and thinking about when we look at these trends. And what I think we do need to do is essentially reassess our view of where these nations are going and what it means then for our investment and our businesses and the like. It doesn't mean that there won't be trade. It doesn't mean that there won't be opportunities. But certainly the golden age of growth in Asia, I think, is over.
So what does it exactly meant then when you say the end of the Asian century? I think there was a prediction that it was going to be something other than it has become. Is that a way to look at it?
Well, we assumed, again, that power was shifting inexorably from west to east, that America and Europe would be eclipsed by a rising Asia. Of course, you can think about this back in the 1980s with Japan, which I was just mentioning. It was the same set of arguments that Japan was going to dominate the global economy and then ultimately become a major political, if not military player. We saw it as the dynamic cockpit of the world and where really the most powerful nations would be. Unfortunately, what we did not look at, again, were all of the weaknesses that were underlying this growth, the weaknesses in the systems. And so it's really not the case that Asia is not going to be important. It is important, but rather that we have overestimated what its role and its importance will be, and we need to recalibrate that. We need to have a more, I would argue, balanced and mature understanding of Asia's weaknesses as well as its strengths, so that we don't get caught by surprise by an economic slowdown or a political crisis or even a military conflict.
But when it comes to the military, too, there seems to be a lot of concern about that, especially that of North Korea. How do you see all this?
Well, look, there are no good answers with North Korea. I think everybody really feels that and understands that. It's been a failure on the part of both Democratic and Republican administrations. It's been a multi-decade failure. We wound up with the very thing that leaders, whether Republicans or Democrats, promised us we wouldn't have, which was a nuclear North Korea. I think if there's an area we need to give the Trump team some slack, it's on North Korea. There really is no good answer. We could focus a lot more on meaningful sanctions that targeted directly the family, the Kim family, and those around them, and targeted their finances. I think that would be a good thing. We certainly have to ensure that we have a credible response for our allies in the case of any type of attack, and essentially come up with a doctrine that says how we will respond. One of the things that's been very difficult for our allies is that the U.S. has never responded and has in fact restrained allies such as South Korea from responding. They feel that has simply allowed North Korea to build more of its weapons, to be provocative, and never pay a price. I think Secretary of Defense Mattis's trip last week to the region sent some very clear messages, but that's rhetorical. It's important, but now you have to figure out what is your policy actually going to be. And so far, whether you're on the left or the right, no one has figured out North Korea. We've allowed it to basically outmaneuver us, out-negotiate us, and it now holds the cards of being, in essence, a nuclear power.
It's kind of interesting, too, as you read in your book, The End of the Asian Century, about, the idea of cooperation or inter-regional cooperation, if you will, and the lack of it. Corruption seems to be one of those big things, and you kind of wonder to yourself, no matter what we're being told, in the news, that, things aren't always what they seem. And when you talk about the amount of corruption that actually goes on over there, you think, how do you negotiate anything ever?
It's huge. It's a major reason why there is so much lack of essentially trust in the political systems, whether they're democratic systems or authoritarian systems. So in fact, you can look at South Korea, a stalwart ally of the United States and a democracy, where just in December, 1 million people were in the streets demanding the impeachment and removal of the president for bribery and graft. And that is something that is replicated throughout other countries in the region, including Malaysia and others. The fact that the ordinary citizens know that the elites play by a different set of rules, are treated differently. Everyone feels the sting of corruption and the demands of corruption. In India, it is ubiquitous. It is obviously a major feature of the rule of the Communist Party in China. And what that really, unfortunately, causes is a cynicism among those throughout Asia, the ordinary citizens of the different states, again, whether they live in a democracy or they live in autocracy. They don't trust the political systems under which they live. And that is a threat. There you can have domestic protests as you had in Korea, or you can have the type of demands for a stronger hand, as in the case of China, to clamp down on protests. So the corruption feeds into a cycle that worsens political relations inside these states, and then sometimes that spills over into relations between them.
Now, one of the things that you don't hear talked about too much, and I've actually had guests on the program in the past where this particular issue came up, is that you take a look at Asia, like especially in Japan, how the birth rate seems to be in decline, and that people are actually having children later on in the years rather than younger, and that you're seeing perhaps in some cases in some Asian states a growing oversupply of uneducated young people, but in some cases there isn't, really a generation coming up to pass on something to, and it just really seems interesting how that's all working out. How do you see that future when it comes to the population lack of or too many?
Well, it's a huge issue. It's what I call the Goldilocks Dilemma. Again, too few people or too many people. In countries like Japan, they are already losing population because for 40 years they've had a below replacement birth rate. They've known about it and they've done nothing to change it. That is also something that's going to happen in South Korea. It's going to happen in a bunch of other nations. But at the same time, being wealthier nations, they're actually able to deal with this type of demographic decline better than others. They have the resources to provide the goods that people are demanding, elderly people are demanding, entitlements and social services and the like. In the case of China, which because of its one China policy for 40 years, will also face a demographic slowdown and eventual decline starting in about 15 years from now, it is not a wealthy country. And the demands will be much harder on the Chinese government, because as people turn away from shrinking families to provide support, they're going to be looking for other sources, and that's likely going to be the government. But the Chinese government has never done that very well. It has, despite being communist, actually has not provided many social services. So this is probably going to be the single greatest source of strain in China in the coming decades. Now, one other point very quickly is that you have other nations that have too many people. Nations like India, Indonesia, Vietnam. These are very young nations that are growing rapidly. It gives them a surplus of labor, but those people are demanding education, they're demanding new resources, they're demanding infrastructure and opportunities and the like. So again, whether you have too many people or too few people, this is really going to be the main driver of pressure on governments in the coming years.
Now, I'm curious, Michael, how do you see what the best policy or way to work with Asia is?
Well, it's a hard question for the U.S. because up till now, really, Asia was very easy to deal with. There was always growth somewhere. There wasn't a real military challenger. For the most part, it was relatively peaceful, certainly compared to when we think about the Middle East and other places like that. So the fact is, we thought, you just had to sort of show up and things would work out. As Woody Allen said, life is, 90% of life is showing up, and that's really how our Asia policy was for years. Now it's a lot harder, and it is important for the United States because we are the most important external player in Asia. Asia's destiny, because of our alliances that we have, because of our trade relations, the political role that we play. There is no other country than the United States that is as important or influential in Asia. So we do have a role. That's why I think something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership was important. It would have started creating a community of liberal trading interests that would have linked some of the political relations with economic relations, and that's actually very significant. We should be thinking more about the values question, about creating a sense of community, again, among liberal nations. It doesn't mean enforcing it. It doesn't mean regime change. But what it does mean is that you work with those who share your values, who think in ways that you do, who are willing to think about an Asia where rules predominate and people are cooperating more than they are competing. And then finally, I think one of the ways that you continue to ensure that is through the United States' military presence, which has been a fundamental part of Asia's post-war development. We can't say for sure what would have happened had the United States not been in Asia, but we do know what did happen with the United States in Asia. The fact that we maintained alliances, we maintained a military presence, we acted in a way as a guarantor of regional stability, allowed these nations to invest more in themselves and not to fight amongst themselves than might otherwise have been the case. So if you change that, then you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think that should be something that guides the administration going forward. I think the early indications are that that's how they are actually going to be approaching this. If you listen to what Secretary Mattis has said, the only area where I'm a little concerned is on trade.
Now, tell us why that is a concern.
Well, again, because I think we need to make sure that we have a robust trading agreement with as many nations in Asia as we can. We want it at what we consider to be a gold standard level so that there are environmental protections and labor protections, transparency, legal mechanisms. China's alternatives do not include that, and if they set those rules and they get nations to trade more or less according to their own way of doing it, then I think we lose out. So the one area where I think the administration needs to be a lot more focused is actually on trade, and they seem to be doing some of the right things on the security side right now.
Now, so do you see, because, again, as I was reading in your book about all this, it was really interesting to think, again, how this seems to be like the early economy of America, sort of like that growing pain that we had, that tended to suffer. You have people, for instance, who were, gangsters that were taking over things during the Prohibition, and you see the political instability, a lot of people, using their political power and influence to do things that really weren't so good for the United States, and moving on, and things such as regulation, especially in the financial markets. and you realize these were growing pains, lessons learned, we kind of recover, we kind of move forward, but here it seems like they're just kind of driving a fast race car, just hoping that the road doesn't run out, it seems like.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think it is more the case that these are structural problems than growing pains. I think if they were growing pains, we would have seen them resolved in the past, and I think they would have been something that would have already sort of gone by the wayside. You would say, well, that was something that was a problem, but corruption has not been resolved. The political tensions have not been resolved. Unfortunately, issues are moving closer to war. So these are issues that I think, unfortunately, really have defined a structural problem that haven't taken seriously enough.
Now, it's interesting when you think of the Indo-Pacific region as regressing into the 19th century style of power politics in which might makes right, as you talk about in the book. We have a concern about North Korea. Nobody really seems to know what to do, as you were mentioning earlier. But what about the rest of Asia when it comes to that? Do you think there'll be infighting going on? Is this something do you feel we're going to be drawn into or pulled into? How do you think this might all play out?
Yeah, that's a real problem and a real question. Is will we be drawn in? We have alliances, we have commitments and responsibilities, and we have to figure out how much we are going to be drawn into something where if they are not able to solve these problems, then they may call upon us. We've seen that with the Chinese and the issue of the South China Sea, and unfortunately is something that is not going away right now. So what we want to do, I think, is maintain a credibility and a clarity of our position so that these things don't actually get worse.
Michael, first of all, I want to thank you for being on the program with us today to talk about your book, The End of the Asian Century. Is there a website people can find out more about your work, how to get the book, things like that?
Sure. The book is on Amazon, of course, and you can go to www.aei.org and then put in my name, Auslin, A-U-S-L-I-N. That'll bring you to my page, and that will give you all the information you need about the book.
Very good. So what do you see yourself doing here in the future? What's your next work or project?
Well, I think there's still more to look at the role of the United States in Asia, why it's important, and how we need to be thinking really about what are our main interests. There's a lot that continues to change in the region and a lot that I think we should be focusing on. I also think, interestingly, that we've really just ignored Japan over the past quarter century. Once its economic bubble burst, we thought it wasn't worthy of study anymore, and yet it has maintained not only a cohesive, developed society, but in many cases has done even better than, I think, many of the nations in the West. So I think that there's a lot of lessons there on how you maintain a modern society, even in the face of economic slowdown.
Interestingly enough, it certainly works for me, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, the book is The End of the Asian Century. Great read. It'll certainly open your eyes to what's really going on around you and kind of keep in tune to what you need to know. You can also discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in Beyond 50 as well as upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past after.